Well, greetings everyone. This recording is of our Future Trends Forum discussion about a new book on higher education finance. It's from the professor, Johns Hopkins University professor, Joshua Travis Brown. And the book is called Capitalizing on College. And what Professor Brown does is very, very interesting. He explores in great detail a series of universities that underwent some interesting experiments in their financial models over the past 20 years. He also interviewed many, many people at each institution, and the results are fascinating. He comes up with a new typology of institutional innovation, and he tracks how these desires to change the financial model of institutions map onto the changing currents in the broader ecosystem. The discussion is great. I have to apologize. I had serious technical issues going into the meeting. My home internet went out. I had to run to a library. Library network wasn't great. There was some ambient noise. And my laptop there just decided to have some issues. I did a lot of editing to buff off those rough edges, so I hope you'll just get the content. Um, in the meantime, enjoy, and of course, please share your thoughts, your questions, your responses in the comments box below. And again, as always, my thanks to the excellent Professor Brown, who was a great guest, and to the superb Future Trends Forum community, who had wonderful thoughts, questions, and overall discussion. Enjoy. To begin, ever since we've launched the Future Trends Forum, we've been talking about higher education economics. We've covered everything from student loans to federal government support to questions of economic labor to financing to economic strategies. What's unusual about this week's book and this week's guest is that we have to wonder about innovations. And I don't mean this in a cliched sense of, all innovations are good, we should all do innovations. What I mean specifically is how colleges and universities, as circumstances have changed, have updated and tried new tactics and new strategies in their own economics, in their own business models. And there's been a great deal of press about this, but nothing very, very thoughtful. This week's guest has done an extraordinary thing. He's identified a series of universities across the United States, ones that are not in the elite. These are tuition-dependent universities, and he'll talk more about that in just a second. But he's identified the strategies they've used in order to try to keep going. So these are not college and universities that are trying to be rich. They are trying to keep their doors open and fulfill their mission. And Professor Brown has done a fantastic job of researching this by talking to hundreds and hundreds of professionals on this. And he's built some really, really interesting models. So without any further ado, let me just introduce Professor Joshua Brown, who has definitely the best background of anybody visually on this chat today. Hello, Professor Brown. How are you doing?
Hey, Brian, thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me into your community.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. I mean, your book is really, really just so good, and this work is so important. Two quick questions
Yeah.
to welcome you here. First of all, is where have we found you in front of this fantastic bookshelf?
So I'm down in my basement. I'm in a room that's maybe 8 foot by 8 foot in an old home that I've remodeled, and this is sort of my little cave, my little library.
Wow.
So I'm in Central Virginia.
Oh, excellent, excellent. I would have
Yeah.
thought you'd be up in Maryland.
Yeah, no, I commute, so it's quite the commute.
Wow. Wow. Well, next time
Yeah.
you swing by, you'll have to swing by Manassas, and I'll
Okay.
buy you some coffee.
Yes,
Oh,
please.
or if you like Ethiopian food, I can take you to our great Ethiopian restaurant.
I'd love that.
Excellent. Well, the more substantial question to ask you is we have a tradition on the forum of introducing people
Okay.
by avoiding the academic obituary style of where you got your degree and
Uh-huh.
what you know. But instead, we're interested in what you're working on next. What's ahead for you for the next year? What are the big projects that you're working on? And what are the ideas that are top of mind for you?
That's a great question. I love that. So the next project that I'm working on, I've got two of them. One of them is a team that I've put together, and we're using social network analysis to understand the evolution and spread of accountability in the field of higher education. What I thought was going to be across the United States, but when I pulled the data, it ended up being across the globe.
Mm.
So we're starting to tell that story now. There'll be a presentation on that with the CGHE folks out of London in September. So we'll unveil that there. You can see a little bit. I posted the registration for that this morning on the social media sites. That's one, is getting my head around higher education accountability and its evolution. How did it spread
Mm.
over time?
Mm.
The other one that I'm trying to get my head around at the moment is what I'm calling, and I need to find a new word for this, and maybe the Mind Hive here can help. I've been using the term hybrid, but as I've started to explain this to folks, they're like, oh, yeah, we know hybrid learning. Since the pandemic, and that's not what I'm talking about, um, my I'm an organizational scholar, and so I always look at higher education through that lens. And so my N is usually one, two, three, four, five. I do case studies. If I'm sitting in the chair running or leading at an institution, what's happened within the last 5 years is many campuses have um, increased their online learning exponentially, such that they're running two student bodies, an online and a residential. If I'm leading and making decisions about the institution, whether that's financial aid, scholarships, activities, whatever that might be, I am having to make decisions for two groups, two types of students. I think we need to rethink our models of retention, persistence, completion, conversion,
Mm.
equity,
Mm.
financial aid. For example, I wrote a paper 2 years ago where we looked at uh, online and residential students during the pandemic. And I wanted to know, like, basically, are the scholarships being given to residential students, or are we giving equitable or equal amounts or of scholarships and financial aid to our online students? Or are our online students merely a cash cow and we use that to subsidize our residential model, which is what I explain in the book? So I want us as a profession to rethink, because our campuses are changing radically. I think our assumptions of our models, which have been based on the last 20 to 30 years of student populations, mostly residentially,
Mm.
I think we need to rethink all of our models one at a time. That's where I'm headed. So when I say hybrid, I have the data right now of one institution, 14 years worth, and we're about to apply for funding. Um, I need two RAs to help me run the quantitative models on this, but I'm about to start to dispatch my research team at this. So I'll pause there, but that's how I'm thinking about the next few years.
What a fantastic project.
Thanks.
What a great idea. I can't think of a better word other than hybrid right now. Um, I'm going to check out the new National Student Clearinghouse report on enrollment. And I'll see if they've got a good term. But if anybody
Okay.
in the chat has an idea,
Oh, yes, please.
this kind of strategy of combining, face-to-face residential along with online learners, I would love to hear that. Um, Brent Enders points out that hybrid has more classroom approach. We're usually referring to the combination of face-to-face and online learning in a given classroom. Um, but it just, of course, if we haven't mentioned this, and if none of you read your emails, Brown is a professor at Johns Hopkins University, which is, and so when we're asking about his research, that's where he's based in, and that's where he's also teaching. Joshua, I admire this book so much, and I'm wondering if you could, just to start, if you could
Yeah.
quickly walk us through first why you decided to pick the institutions you did, and then secondly, if you just step us through the different strategies that you've identified that they've been using. And friends, if you're new to the forum, this is not a formal presentation. Our guest is going to answer these questions, and then it's going to be over to all of you for your questions. So please, as he unfolds his work, think about what you'd like to ask him. Clarification, pushback, agreement, stories to support this, all kinds of good stuff. So again, Professor Brown, why did you pick these particular schools, and what do you see them doing?
Yeah, let me start out by telling you the failed approach. When I went, so this was my dissertation research, and when I went in to defend the proposal, one of the committee members, who was an outside committee member from Stanford, looked at the sample of institutions. I had 8 schools, and he said, "You're sampling on your dependent variable." And I said, "What?" He goes, "Of course you're going to find growth. All of your schools are growing." He
Mm,
said, and if I had not listened to him, the book would not be what it is today. He said, you need to do either 4 high, 4 low, or you need to do a high, medium, low, negative growth. And so that's what I did. So there are 8 schools. And at the time, I was coming at this from a Weberian Protestant ethic approach. I was interested at the time in sociology of religion, sociology of organizations.
mm,
And I was going to compare Protestants to Catholics. And so there are 4 Protestant schools, 4 Catholic schools, high, medium, low, negative growth. And I went and I lived on each of those 8 schools for 1 full week each. And I would arrive on a Sunday. And on Monday morning, I would take the admissions tour as if I were a student.
mm,
And then I would meet with the president. The president would welcome me in, and I was off. And I would interview up to 5 people a day for 5 days in a row. And I would eat at the cafeteria. At some places, I stayed in a hotel next to campus. At some places, I stayed on campus. I dug around in the archives and I did all sorts of stuff and I gathered all sorts of things. And at the end of 10 months, I had interviewed 151 people. I collected over 6 million words across 350 volumes of their alumni magazines. I had their IRS reports, all kinds of things. And what I didn't expect was when I arrived on campus and I asked this question, could you tell me your story of innovation? This is why the book turned out the way it did, because of what they told me and what I didn't expect. They said, absolutely. But to understand the innovation you're seeing today, we actually have to take you back to 1975, or we have to take you back to 1989. We have to take you back to 1996, because it was in those moments. We were 110 million in debt. We were 60 million in debt. We were going to close. We didn't know how we were going to stay open. And in those moments, and then this is my words, not theirs, they jettisoned the norms of higher education and said, we're no longer going to do what the elites tell us to do. We're no longer going to do best practice. We're going to go and do what we feel is innovative. And they pursued it. And so these schools, I didn't know when I had picked them. Again, I just picked based off of high, medium, low, negative growth rates. And so they told me what you see in the book is 4 different strategies of how they grew. And the goal was, and I'll pause after I give you this visual, turn it back over to you, Brian. The goal from a research perspective was if I could create an artificial starting line in the year 2000 and put all 8 institutions on the starting line and let the gun fire and let the race begin. And as they circled around the track, what could explain the differences in speed? What could explain the differences in growth rate, given that they were all approximately resourced the same at the start of the race? And so that's the story of the book and the story of those strategies and how it unfolds. So I've talked for a while. I'll turn it back to you for that.
Well, that's that. Thank you for explaining that, especially the dissertation advisor who challenged you very productively. It's
Yeah.
a classic example of this. One of the things I admire about your book is that you avoid the elites. So we're not looking at Stanford or Harvard.
Mhm. So Brian's right. What he's alluding to is what I have come to call the missing middle. And Brian opened saying that, hey, this was about the economics of higher education. And he's right, but I'm not an economist. And there's this line, one of my favorite lines in the book at the beginning is it says, this is about the economics of higher education, but there's no numbers, there's no budget sheets, and there's no economic formulas in the book whatsoever. The book is all about stories. And so the way that I explain the missing middle is this. A lot of the research that I read looked at student loans on one end or the feds at the other end. And what was missing in the middle was this perspective of the voices of the people in the trenches, the voices of the people trying to keep these organizations open. And so what I tried to do as a ethnographer, a researcher, just a curious human being wanting to understand how the world worked in higher education, I sought to give voice to this whole strata of people that really had, in my opinion, hadn't been given a voice or hadn't been given the platform. And that again, as Brian alluded to, these weren't elite institutions. These were all tuition-driven institutions. And so these were folks where, from a research perspective, if right, if you're a quantitative researcher, you're going to control what you're trying to look at by adding in your control variables. And from a case study perspective, what you want to try to do is to narrow down the institutional you control by this type of institutions that you pick. And so for me, wanting to understand how an institution gets their money, tuition money, and what do they do with tuition money meant I needed to focus on tuition driven institutions, not those who were augmenting with other revenue streams like executive education, athletics, grants,
Yeah.
mega donors, et cetera, et cetera. What I didn't anticipate was, and then my argument is this, right? Now that we're watching the grant margins implode, we're watching the endowment margins via taxes implode. My argument now is that everybody is becoming more tuition driven, and this book
Yes.
offers a roadmap forward for the various strategies that institutions are going to rely on, with even greater emphasis on competition. And I want to underscore that because competition is sort of the bedrock that we've built our system of higher education on. And what you read in the pages of capitalizing on college um, is just going to accelerate. Welcome back, Brian.
Well, my apologies for falling out. This is a day of technical challenges on my side, and my apologies for that. And I appreciate what I heard of you, Josh. The question that I was putting to you, and by the way, thank you for emphasizing the tuition dependent nature of institutions. I sometimes hear people from elite institutions describe that like it's a niche, but it is in fact the very broad mainstream. If you could just outline some of these innovative strategies, one of them was accelerate, one of them was network. If you just talk
Mhm.
about these, because I don't think everyone here will be aware of these or have thought of them in these terms.
No, not at all. So as you go through the book, there are four strategies, and the book, I described this to Brian earlier. I wanted a book that felt like a novel, and I described this work um, using the term scholarly novella. I just made it up. It sounded nice to me, um, but I wanted folks to be able to read it as though it were a novel in a book. And as you do, as you go through it, I wanted it to feel like a market as well. So I really debated, do I begin with the most aggressive school, and I decided I wouldn't. I would start with the baseline, and then as you get past the baseline, the traditional strategy, things just take off. And I wanted it to feel like, like you're going up on that roller coaster or that stock spike, right? I wanted this to feel like a market. When you open the pages of the book, you get to the traditional strategy, and all of the strategies are the same. And there's a visual diagram, and I sort of wish I had it here with me. Um, but at the center is the residential core in the diagram. And off on the sides are peripheral markets and the endowment. And what happens is that the residential core in the United States, the on-campus model, is not a profitable model, and it requires subsidies. It always has required subsidies. And the thrust of the book is that where are institutions finding these subsidies? So in the traditional model, they take the revenues from the endowment and they subsidize the residential model. And they break even, they use it for scholarships, et cetera, et cetera. What I didn't anticipate, right, as I arrive on campus to do these interviews, this model is falling apart. The leaders of the two institutions in this chapter are like, we can't sustain this. The reason they can't sustain it is because they were having to spend all of the efforts that they were doing to grow their endowment, they had diverted those to overhaul their physical campuses. And there's two business terms I had to create in the book. One is called margin capitalization. And what that is, it's where you take the margins from tuition or whatever product you are. You might be a hospital or a museum or an NGO.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you take your margins and you capitalize, you build out the physical assets. And one of the most important things about this book is the last 20 years in American higher education is not a story of lazy rivers and climbing walls. The last 20 years, it's about the complete physical transformation of American campuses, like George Washington, like George Mason, like Elon, like and and you'll see that in this book, right? Is that these leaders under stress realize this isn't sustainable and they start to look for a new strategy. The strategy that they look for is what is in chapter 2, which is the pioneer strategy. The pioneer strategy, those folks were the first movers. They were the first people into military ed, they were the first people into adult ed, they were the first people into high schools and hotels and classrooms that were non-traditional. In chapter 1, the assumption was this: you come to a tradition. But in chapter 2, the innovation here is that these folks figured out how to take the classroom to the students. And so I'll give you an example, right? In one of the states, there was no community college system, but there was a board member who owned a hotel chain throughout the state. And they decided that they were going to hold classes rather than to have everybody in the state drive to the campus. They were going to use the hotels, the 60 to 80 hotels throughout the state, and they were going to ship the faculty members to those hotels, and students would stay in those hotels Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and the conference rooms would be reserved for that class. And you saw this over and over again where classrooms, in-person classrooms, were taken to the students themselves. And so they flipped it on the head. That was a residential core, and the periphery market here was adult ed. And it was done in, or sometimes it was military ed or whatever it was, but they picked a model and then they replicated it by site. And this is really
Mm.
important. They
Mm.
replicated sites. So it would have been one central location, 40 different sites. And this is important because it's one type, right? It's
Hmm.
all hotels. And they replicate this, and you can see, like if I were to pull their financials, you would see a massive spike in revenues. I don't show you that in the book, but
Oh.
again, when I'm there, this model is collapsing and they're looking to the next model. And that next model up, instead of one type, they have multiple types. So they're doing hotels, they're doing international ed, they're doing adult ed, they're doing online, they're doing, and what they're doing is they're pulling the margins from all of these periphery markets
Hmm.
back to the main campus. And then, so another central story about American higher education over the last 20 years, it's been adult ed and online ed who have subsidized the residential model. We get
I
mad
just
at Phoenix.
can I
Go
just
ahead.
can I
Yeah,
just
yeah,
pause you for that for a second? I want to
yeah.
make sure everybody hears that online education was supporting the residential model. So this is just, there's been plenty of evidence of this, but it hasn't quite gone to the mainstream. But I want to make sure everyone hears that, just what a huge innovation that is, and how counterintuitive it is for quite a few people. Sorry to interrupt. I just want to underscore that.
No, absolutely. I'm glad that we can have an exchange here. So by all means, the what they do is that again they're taking these margins and they're pulling it back in and subsidizing the residential model. And again, we would sort of get mad at the for-profits and say, they're spending $40 million on advertising, but
Mhm.
but these nonprofits were doing the exact same thing, but they were spending the $40 million on buildings for a different population, right? The residential students. And so that's sort of where, as a researcher, I was wrestling with this, knowing what as a nation we have these narratives that we've told ourselves. And again, this is also why I'm relying on story here. This isn't a journal article where I can say for every change in X, there's an X increase in Y. Um, I believe that we as people need a story and we story to one another. And I am out to try to change some of the stories that we've told one another in American higher education by giving voice to this missing middle of folks who have, in my mind, uh, been overlooked. So that was
Which is,
strategy number three.
mhm.
Do you want me to pause, Brian, or dive right into strategy four?
Well, if I just remind everybody, there's been some really interesting conversation in the chat, and
Okay.
I just want to raise a couple of comments that have come up from there.
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
One is people have compared this to Britain's Open University and
Mhm.
also to Walden University. And I'm wondering if you want to respond to that.
Yeah. So I'm not too familiar with the model that Open runs. Um, strategy four would be the closest to that. So the strategies I've described up to now, strategies one, two, and three in the book, they're pretty much maintaining sort of this like 2-to-1 ratio, 1-to-1 or 2-to-1, right? Um,
Mm,
periphery to residential. The differentiating, and this is what the end of chapter three gets at. The two schools in chapter three try to crack the code to scale, and they can't. One school tries. One of the Catholic leaders, the way they try it is they try to insource the OPM, right? So instead of relying on the OPM, the online program manager, to outsource, they try to bring and they say, if they're making 40% on all of this profit, what happens if we bring all of that profit back in for us?
hmm hmm
And they fail at it. And this administrator looks at me and she says, "Ah, oh, it's like we've it's like we've killed the goose that's been giving us our golden eggs." And she's really wrestling with this. And
Yeah.
they're looking for the next strategy and they can't crack the code. And when you get to the next level in chapter 4, and I'm getting back to your Walden Open, when you get to chapter 4, what happens is instead of just more students growth, it's more money per student. So it's growth plus margins, right? I'm increasing enrollment, and instead of making $1,000 per student, I'm making $1,750 per student per semester. And I increase those margins and I increase enrollment. And so I make what I call super profits. And so when you can scale that, when you can hold your costs flat and increase enrollment, then you can really ramp up your enrollment. And in the case of chapter 4, that ratio goes to 10 to 1.
10 to 1.
They have 10 times what, yeah. And so at the end of the book, at the end of the race, after everybody's run their lap, remember, they were darn near equivalent in the year 2000, and they had they didn't even have online at that point. And so by the end of the book, this institution has tenfold online students to residential students. And so that's where I might put Walden and Open. The leaders in that book explain that their competitors who are running the accelerated model are Southern New Hampshire, Arizona State, Central Florida,
Yeah.
Penn State.
Yeah.
They name their competitors, Ohio State. And you can look at any institution, just pull the data in the government databases, and you can run those ratios and ask yourself, to what extent are these online students subsidizing the residential experience? So that would be my response to the Walden and Open model.
Well, thank you, Lisa, and I think Tom for those comparisons, and Joshua, thank you for that detailed reply and analysis and response. Why don't you in the chat, just not for not as a question, but just in comment, people are observing that the key is support, and people are talking about the necessity of student groups and staff who do this. But if you could tell us about a couple of those other strategies further in your novella. What are these other strategies that these institutions are doing?
Yeah, so some of the other things that they do toward the end of the book is you see them start to tinker with product innovation and process innovation. Product innovation, there's this one administrator who basically tells me, he goes, I had a dream, I had a vision. And he said, I was standing in front of this old Western storefront. And on this side of the store was one product. And on this side of the store was another product as far as the eye could see.
Hmm.
And he said, this store fundamentally only sold 2 products. And he looked at me and he said, that was our institution. We had an online MBA, and he called it this tramp stew sort of hodgepodge thing,
Hmm.
interdisciplinary degree that anybody could get if we could just get everything into a bundle. And he said, I thought to myself, what do we have on the residential side that if we converted to the online side, we could have more than 2 products in this store? And keep in mind, he was thinking of products as degrees, not classes.
Hmm.
That
Hmm.
was the innovation. The innovation is we have this little thing, these little plastic rings. And when I take a Coke can and I put them in that plastic ring, I now have a 6-pack. Or if I take 12 of them and put them in a box, I've got the beast,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that's the innovation. Or if I put a fry and a burger and a Coke into a bundle, I've got a combo. And instead of selling a burger, I'm selling a combo. And
So
at the time when this administrator had his vision, the world was just selling classes. They weren't selling degrees. And so the story that he tells is that summer I took 85 different courses over the course of 3 months, I took their syllabi, converted them from residential to online. And he said, we went from selling 2 degrees to 35 overnight. And our growth rate went from 8% to 42% in 4 months.
Wow. Wow, wow, wow. Which institution was this?
Ardmore, the one in chapter 4.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's the product innovation. That's an example of how they were working with that. Another thing at the end toward is process innovation, where what they were trying to do was look through Fortune 500 companies and say, what sort of processes are they adopting out there that we could pull in here that would increase our margin? Again, this is their emphasis. It was margin. Others might have a different goal. Maybe it's student success, or some other type of outcome that they might be uh, aspirational towards achieving. But for this institution, it was specifically, how can we increase our margin? So they looked to the airlines. They saw how the airlines were overbooking,
Mm.
and they began to do the same for drop ad. And so what they would do is they knew that if a course would, a 25 seat course would eventually get down to, say, 15 students 2 weeks later by drop ad, they would deliberately over enroll to 35,
Mm. Mm.
knowing that it would eventually get down to what they wanted and around 25. So when you've got 20 sections of English 101 and you increase everybody by 10, you now only need 15 sections and you reduce your labor costs. And for them, that was a process innovation, not a product innovation. And it helped them increase their margins. I think he said either by $5 or $8 million per semester in cost savings.
Wow. Wow, wow, wow. I mean, that's an amazing shift. And also, it reminds me of, we've been talking for about 20 years about unbundling higher education. That you're describing as ways of rebundling it in
Correct.
a productive way. Well, thank you for explaining this. I can testify to the excitement of reading this novella. And friends, this has appeared in the chat already. But let me ask you all, what questions do you have about this? What comments and thoughts you have about this? I'll pull some more out of the chat,
Okay.
but please add some more. And if you'd like to, everybody, just feel free to use the the Q&A box. We'd be glad to see that if you like, or I can just hoist these out from the chat. Drew, I believe it's Timon, and if it's Thyman, I mispronounced that, Drew. I apologize. He says, it seemed like this would only work in institutions where tenured faculty haven't leveraged their bargaining power in a union or non-union sense in order to impose their will on course caps. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so some of the institutions were heavy tenure, some of them were less tenure. In chapter 3, I talk about what I call the two towers.
Mm.
And what happens is that there is a strong faculty senate, faculty governance tower that controls the curriculum from the bottom up to the president. But the president also knows that he has to be quick to market and that speed is vital and imperative in the system that we all have built that's based on market competition.
Mm-hmm.
And so what he does is he sets up, anytime that he wants to be quick to market, he sets up a program that reports directly to him, because those revenues he wants to oversee. And I'm saying he because all 8 of my presidents in the book were males at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I parallel this in the book, right? Because you've got one tower that goes faculty up, and then you've got one tower that goes president down. And then I make this claim, this isn't uncommon in higher education if you consider athletics
Hmm.
that report to the president.
Hmm.
And there's these vital elements of the institution where the president knows I can't have this mess up. And in those instances, what I explain in the book is you've got two towers. Faculty, in my opinion, and I didn't say this in the book, in my opinion, in today's competitive environment where enrollments are at stake and resources are scarce, faculty are going to have to learn, if that's the right word, to come to the table not just with a critique, but with solutions.
Hmm.
It's fine to come, like we have been trained with a critical mind. We've been trained to say, yeah, but we've been trained to say, have you considered this other vantage point? But if we're going to have institutions that thrive, that meet enrollment, I think that faculty are going to have to show up to the bargaining table, the curriculum table, the faculty senate table, the C-suite, where appropriate, with solutions, not just critiques with uh, their heels dug in. And I say that only because I'm running two stereotypes, two typologies here with the two towers. I know there's much more nuance than that. So, but great
No,
question.
that's well, it's a fascinating metaphor and a productive one, and thank you for the great question. We have another question from Lisa Durf, our good friend and mistress of the pun, who asks, "Are these trends that you've described, these different models, are they found in HBCUs?"
That's such a lovely question. Um, I only looked at these tuition-driven institutions. As the book opens, I explained that there are other tuition-driven institutions like HSIs, HBCUs, PBIs, ANAPESIs, women's colleges, tribal colleges, a variety of them. And I make an argument that I only look at these schools, the religious schools, one, because they're the largest group, there's 900 of them in the United States that are religiously affiliated according to IPEDS. The next level down in the tuition driven sector is the HSIs, which are roughly like 460, 480. The HBCUs are at 107 at the moment. I don't know how many PBIs there are. So I deliberately looked at the highest ones. I would love for somebody to replicate this or do some sort of similar study at an HBCU. Um, I would hope that many of these principles would apply. I would have to think through if they're actually, and it's not even think through, I would have to pull the enrollment data to see if there is an institution that sort of has this 2-to-1, 3-to-1 online or
Mhm.
periphery. Is there sort of a high growth HBCU? I don't know the sector that well as others might. So maybe you might be able to speak to that. But that's a fantastic question.
Indeed, and Lisa, if you want to say more in the chat, please feel free to. Thank you. And friends, if you're new to the forum, this is an example of the kind of discussion that we have going. Our friend Maria Plototsky has 2 points to raise. One of them is that overbooking classes may help with labor costs in the short run, but it causes other problems because students don't get the attention and support they need. They may withdraw and leave the school. And then second, saving on labor is a big part of what got higher ed into the mess it is in the first place. If you want to respond to Maria's points, please do.
Yeah, so these institutions really are trying to control their labor costs. Those labor costs, when I asked the presidents and the vice presidents, they said it generally comprises between 60 and 75% of their
Hmm.
overall expenditures
Sounds right.
for the institution. So they really are trying to get that down. Um, they were trying to create other support structures, whether that was say, for example, academic or non-academic, right? So some institutions were bolstering their mental health resources. Some institutions were bolstering their intramurals so that all students could be physically active and involved, not just those that were part of the NCAA aspect of it. And then there were others that were setting up new sort of pedagogical innovations that were, a lot of them were modeling after the math lab at Virginia Tech that became pretty
Mhm,
famous.
mhm,
Um, so they did try to create some support in other areas in student affairs. Um, but again, it's this tension between money and mission, purpose and profit of how can we get more profit to keep the doors open, but how do we still maintain what we're committed to for educational opportunity and educational access, particularly for students who didn't get into Harvard or
mhm.
Stanford or Penn State, right? These schools describe themselves as second chance schools. And they do that because they say, we accept the students who tried to get in elsewhere, but we're giving them the second chance. We're giving them an opportunity to earn a credential. Um, so that tension, there isn't an easy answer that I have for you on that specific question, other than as you go through the book, I hope you actually feel the tension that these administrators are going through, which is exhibited in the very point that you actually made, which is an excellent one.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons I enjoyed your novella is because you really gave a sense of the emotions involved.
Mhm.
Friends, if we're talking a lot about data, we're talking a lot about economic trends, but the book is all prose, and you really get a sense of the people involved and their passions and their fears. These are high risk gambles in a lot of ways. Uh, Along those lines, our friend and today's co-host, Ruben Puentadora, asks, what does long-term sustainability look like for each of these four strategies?
Yeah, that's really hard. Um, Particularly because one, COVID, um, two, we have a system that's fundamentally built on competition.
Yes.
And that's evidenced really, if you've seen in the last 48 hours, the Wall Street Journal piece that came out by Doug Belkin, where it's as if all of a sudden mainstream media just sort of, stumbled on the tuition driven sector. It's been here all along. Our minority student serving institutions have been here all along. The data that I provide um, are from these types of institutions. And so in that piece that Doug writes on, he shows you, he contrasts um, the University of Wisconsin-Madison and all of the other institutions in the state, the other satellite campuses. And they do the same thing with Tennessee, the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. And they show you that the growth rate over the last, I think it's like 8 years, maybe 10, at Knoxville and Madison have exploded. And the growth rate at these other institutions in the state system, have either been flat or declined. I would argue that what we're seeing here in these state schools, whether it's Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or Tennessee or any state really, is that the state schools are also becoming tuition driven. They're having to live by the per student funding formula that the federal government offers. And that formula is more money, more students equal more money.
Right.
And if you want more money, you've got to get more students. And every administrator knows this. And so the story of the book is that how in the world do we grow? How do we get these students? And what they discover at the end of the book, and what I tell you, Ruben, is that they discover what I call policy innovation. And it's a policy innovation that isn't the traditional type. They actually turn policy innovation on its head. Policy innovation is when you create a law that is supposed to incentivize innovation. What these individuals do in a very innovative and entrepreneurial way, they pull the policies in to the very marketplace that they themselves are in. And so what happens is I take this formula over here, more students equal more money, and I take this policy over here, which is threshold funding, and if I can combine them, I can make even more money. What I
Mm,
mean by that is if you surpass 10% Asian American, if you surpass 25% Hispanic, and if you
mm,
surpass 40% Black African American, you get more money with this policy over here. And this policy over here is per student. And so if I can combine those in innovative ways, then I can get even further money from those policies. Because of the level of competition throughout the sector is continuing to intensify, what you're seeing from a sustainability standpoint is I have to either innovate harder, I have to act quicker, my product has to be shortened. It's sort of this race to the bottom. And
mm.
and and I need to get larger, but I also have to control my costs, right? And that's where that last school finally cracked that code. So those are sort of the things from a sustainability standpoint that administrators that I interviewed were starting to pursue. And that's just again to, as you said, to keep the lights on and to remain
Yeah,
sustainable. That was a great question, Ruben.
and to do the mission. Yeah,
Yes,
Ruben is
exactly.
fantastic. If you don't all know Ruben, of course you should. He's been a guest on this program several times, and you should all pay attention to everything he does. When you mentioned Doug Belkin at the Wall Street Journal, are you referring to the article about college towns after colleges close?
Yes.
Yeah, I put a link to that in the chat, which
Okay,
I
perfect.
strongly recommend. Doug Belkin is a very, very good journalist in the score. He's been a guest actually once in the program, and
Oh,
the
nice.
piece is very moving. We have a question from a really good friend who couldn't make it here today,
Okay.
but he wanted me to ask the question anyway. And there's a bit of a setup to it. This is
Okay.
our friend Keel Lumsch, and he's curious about accreditation. So let me just put this up.
Okay.
Um, Many students go to college for prestige, the college experience, like sports and parties, but most of all for the degrees that control access to most white collar jobs. Regarding the latter, I think it's a big conflict of interest for colleges to act as both the teaching entity and the credentialing entity. It means that students are required to pay for access to jobs, and colleges have little incentives to rein in their prices. So, based on that, he adds skills based hiring and third party credentialing, similar to the CFA exam but more thorough, removed from the control of colleges, would put higher ed's emphasis back on the learning mission. Does Dr. Brown support a move to third party credentialing, or is he in favor of colleges continuing to issue degrees and employers requiring them for employment?
I would be in favor of I would be in favor of third party accrediting or competency that could quantify, illustrate, I hesitate to say prove, but illustrate the value add.
Hmm,
Um, Similar to, say, the NCLEX exam for nurses or anything that ABET in engineering is offering, right? So we have these discipline, and this is where accreditation gets complex because you have the six accrediting bodies like SACS and WASC and others up here, higher learning, but you also
hmm,
have the disciplinary accrediting bodies down here, whether that's medicine, optometry, ABET, and nursing, whatever it may be. The challenge is, and I do address this in the book. Um, the challenge is that the standards for the accrediting body up here are pretty broad because they actually have to apply to a broad swath of institutions, right? So SACS accredits schools from Virginia to Texas and
Right.
everybody in between, right? And so it's small schools to big state schools, and so those standards have to cover a broad set of institutions. In the book, as I'm speaking with one of the presidents and the deans of one of the schools that just opened, she expresses tension about the disciplinary accrediting standards that she has to maintain and how
Hmm.
costly those have become to her above and beyond the SACS accrediting body. And so there's a quote that she says where she goes, the SACS accrediting body doesn't care how many students we have in a classroom. We've got students hanging off the walls at the undergraduate level because they don't assess that. She goes, at the graduate level, in our school of X, we have to have X amount of faculty. We have to have a ratio of this. We have to have X amount of dollars spent on labs. And she goes, it just gets extremely costly to run this model. Uh, and then she makes this claim, our undergrads are suffering or part of the consequence of these standards at the more stringent graduate level. What the question that you posed, I'm not sure if it falls into that dichotomy that exists presently or not. Um, and so if maybe what you're proposing is this third party that would operate independently, or maybe their question is down here at this lower level that I've described. But I don't want to conflate vocational and professional graduate like engineering.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I do try to address that tension. And I really like your innovative question about maybe there's a third way that gets beyond the dichotomy that we're really stuck in at the moment. I'll pause there.
Well, I'm afraid we all have to pause here because we have
Oh,
somehow reached the end of our hour.
I'm sorry.
And well, quite the opposite. Josh, you've been a fantastic guest. I mean, you're sharing so beautifully the depths of your really, really solid and important research, and I'm just delighted that you've been able to do this. And friends, I'm just as always, I'm so impressed by the questions and comments you've shared. One quick question for two people, Brent Anders and Charles Findlay. Would you mind, we're out of time, if I could follow up with our guest by email with your questions? Please let me know either in the chat or you can email me.
Yes,
A
please.
question I have for you, Josh, is besides buying your book, which everyone should do, how can we keep up with your work?
I've got a Substack. If you can subscribe there, I'm trying to release portions of the book, ideas about the book, every 2 weeks. So you can find me on LinkedIn, on Substack, Twitter occasionally. But by all means, reach out and connect there.
Excellent.
And if you get a copy of the book, throw it up on social media for me, please. I would love that.
Indeed, indeed. And Lisa Durf has already been following you on Substack. There are a bunch of great responses. Josh, thanks again. This
Thanks for
is really
having me.
important work, and I'm glad we could talk about it and maybe take it further. And I'm really looking forward to your upcoming work,
Thank you.
both reading more of your thoughts on Substack, but also the research you described an hour ago. And next time you're hurtling past Nova, please
Okay,
let me know so that we can hang out.
I'd love
Uh,
that.
Me too. Friends, let me just wrap things up with a couple of notes. Thank you again for all of your questions and comments. If you'd like to look into our previous sessions where we've discussed academic strategy and academic and economics, just go again to the Future Trends Forum website, forum.futureofeducation.us. We have more sessions scheduled up, including topics as various as AI and leadership. Above all, everybody, thank you for your patience dealing with my technical challenges on my end today. I really appreciate thinking through everything with you. I hope you're all enjoying a solid May, and I hope you all take care. We'll see you next time online.
Awesome.
Bye-bye.
Bye.